Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that you are all doing well. I am joined by a great poster, a great reader of text that even I haven't had the chance to read yet. And boy, oh boy, this recommendation was my worldview about sort of historical analysis kind of changed. This is one of those texts that you will hear me reference and refer to for many years and many streams to come. But I am joined by the one and only Zoomer Schopenhauer. How are you, sir?
I'm fine. Had a very garlicky dinner, so luckily I don't have any dates, so there's nothing to worry about in that respect. But I'm happy to talk about Goldstone.
Yeah, well, this is what we're talking about. And before we had went live on the air, this title is so dry, but really one of the best sort of niche historical analyses sort of texts that I've read in a very long time, and definitely was catered for academics and not people like us. But I'm really glad that you had recommended it because you had posted a few weeks, barely a month or so ago now, about these four books that had, that are part of your worldview and how you look at the world. And
Yeah.
I've read three out of four of them, and I was like, "Oh, this Goldstone one looks interesting," and you had really recommended it to me,
Yes.
and so I'm very glad that you did. I'm halfway through this text. It is quite a lengthy read for the audience. I mean, you can get the 25th
Mm.
edition that I have up on the screen here, but with all the footnotes included, it's a little over 600 pages, with plenty of great graphs and figures and analysis if you want to dive into that. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk
Yeah.
about revolution, rebellion, and we're going to focus the one on the revolution that I think most of my audience is going to be familiar with, which is the French Revolution. But Zoomer Schopenhauer, why would you recommend this book to people?
Well, I think that a lot of people who consider themselves to be nationalists of some kind consider that demographics is a fundamental aspect of any political theory. um, we came up with the whole phrase demographics is destiny. And so, aside from the sort of talking points that you're not allowed to bring up in the mainstream relating to a lot of information about demographics, just your foundational understanding of how the mathematics and the science of demography works and how it impacts on historical events and political processes is very, very important. And what Goldstone really identifies is that demographic trends, they don't determine politics in a straightforward way. That would be demographic determinism, which would be a long list of political determinisms of some kind, like Marxist economic determinism, which aren't that interesting. It's that demographics is sort of the one thing which all levels of society can't ignore, which affect everything. Um, and that's very true. And you see a lot of how that works detailed in the book, which is a classic text which has influenced a huge amount of subsequent scholarship about revolution, about political change. There is a whole field which this book is just absolutely referenced all the time in. You have people like Karotayev, Leonid Grinin, Peter Turchin, and so forth. And really, a huge amount of it goes straight back to this text in terms of where they're picking up from and where they're making new models from, which is really, really cutting edge political analysis for the 21st century.
Yeah, and reading the opening part, not just Goldstone's 25th anniversary notes, but the first three chapters has been a really radical departure from, say, the more mainstream scholarly work, or even the I don't want to call them meme books, but the ones that either everyone says that they've read or that
Mm.
they claim to have read, or maybe read the cliff notes of. Whether there's a lot of emphasis, of course, on cyclical factors and cyclical
Yes.
history. Which, I mean, there are cycles in here, and Goldstone makes note of it because you cannot analyze demographics or revolution in a purely linear, secular form of progress, or what might get
Yeah.
called Whig history.
Yeah.
So no, I mean, this book is really good in highlighting those cyclical factors. But I mean, this one in particular really breaks down a lot of the perhaps I don't want to call it the consensus, but perhaps we have these ideas in mainstream worldviews of history, where people will kind of take little bits and pieces of Wallerstein, or they'll take
Mhm.
these sort of default, I don't want to call it outright Marxist, but things that you kind of hear in college, and you're like, oh, this is how the way that the world works, and we can kind of apply this model. And Goldstone does an exceptional job with the literature, but also his own
Yes.
analysis to tell you why that is not the case.
Yes. Well, I mean, I don't think that it lends itself necessarily to cyclical history in the sense that there isn't like a sort of a preset pattern of this is how things go. It always goes round in this circle, which we can predict. It really does focus on a number of nonlinear dynamics, nonlinear trends in history, which we can observe, of which there are sort of many cycles. So I mean, for example, my critique of Spengler isn't that I don't think that there's real cycles that he describes. I think it's because there's more cycles than he describes. Like within the Roman Empire, you know, you can at least see three cycles minimum of the sort of Republican era, then the Principate era under Augustus, and then after the crisis of the third century, the Dominate cycle, each of which have their own set of problems, and where you know it doesn't fit into one cohesive narrative, where you can just observe a one secular trend from start to finish. I mean, secular in this context just means like a continuous like line of development. And the main thing that he's focused on is Europe and Eurasia and Asia as well, actually, from 1500 to 1850. And this is a period in which there are multiple cycles of recurring violence and state breakdown, which don't happen at random intervals. They happen simultaneously across Europe around about the same time. And the most famous incident of this is 1848, but you also see kind of just during that whole period from around the late 18th century to the mid 19th century is the age of revolution, as is described by some historians. So why is it that there are so many breakdowns in this period where there weren't from 1660 to 1760? There's very, very few state breakdowns. That's not because it's a period which lacks violence or anything like that. There's no shortage of wars and upheaval, but there's very little in the way of breakdowns or total societal breakdown. And then, of course, you go back further than this book, and there is the crisis of the High Middle Ages, and the breakdown of the late Middle Ages, which then, I mean, he doesn't get into that so much in this book, but there's plenty of material on it. But it is a cyclically recurring feature. So he wants to explain, well, why is it that there's a general crisis of the 17th century? Why is it that there's an age? Why is it that we keep getting these cyclically recurring breakdowns across Eurasia, occurring roughly simultaneously with each other?
Yeah, he has a great section here in the beginning in the chapter called The Central Problem, because if you try and make these overgeneralizations, or you try to bring them down to very few root causes or singular variables, you and I both know that univariate analysis leads to some really
Mm.
terrible conclusions. But he writes here, quote, while historians might indeed insist on the uniqueness of each crisis, this view gives rise to occasional paradoxes. As J. Clark has rightly pointed out, historians analyzing the 17th century England often describe the period of 1540 to 1640, or 1688 and 1689, as marking the final decline of royal and aristocratic prestige and a crucial turning point in the liberation of Parliament from the king and the aristocracy. At the same time, historians analyzing 19th century England describe the period from 1740 to the Reform Bill of 1832 in precisely the same way. They cannot both be right. That is, unless the late 17th and the early 18th centuries marked a revival of power and prestige of the monarchy and aristocracy, so that the battle fought in the 17th century needed to be fought again in the 19th. The allowance of cyclical elements in political and social trends resolves this paradox. And that's what we really kind of want to focus here on, the cyclical side, not these sort of broad, general, here are things that we can point out to on a map. They kind of get read in these popular um, literature in our circles, whether it be Toynbee or whether it be Spengler in
Yeah,
particular.
I mean, I think that a good place to begin is with a scholar that's not mentioned very much in this book, but it was called Wilhelm Abel. And Wilhelm Abel in 1935 published a study of agrarian crises in Europe, from the Middle Ages to the present. And The point is, in that book, what he really kind of undermined was monetarism, which is to say the theory of inflation, where inflation is just about money supply. Like you think of your sort of Weimar Germany or Zimbabwe dollar. You think of your cases where the state just dumps money into the economy and undervalues the currency. In your medieval cases, you're talking about debasement. But the point being, a government which undermines its own currency is always regarded as an aberration, as failing to fulfill its basic functions. And it doesn't explain the long term motions of prices, of which we have decent data going back throughout this entire period. And the point is that what actually explains price fluctuations of cereals, grain, and so forth over the last millennium, where Europe we really have the best data, and where you get agricultural crisis is these cyclical patterns of population growth. It's supply and demand. If you have a rapidly rising population and a stagnant per capita agricultural production, then the price of grain goes up. And we see over and over again, this is the underlying cause of inflation. I mean, in today's economy, you look at, say, the last 30 years of British energy prices. I mean, it's not difficult to figure out why the energy prices are going up so high when we've had almost no increase in energy production and very, very high levels of immigration. And you know, these are the inescapable facts which lead to inflation, although they can be manipulated on top by, say, monopolistic control by a particular company or the government printing money and undermining the currency. I mean, there's all sorts of things which can lie on top of the demographic bases. But the point is, this is the fundamental thing which is driving it, and you can see this very clearly in graphs. But Goldstone follows this and says, well, what you tend to get are political crises around the periods when you are overpopulated, when you have growth in the population, you have an increasing share of your population which is filled with young men. You get diminishing returns from labor productivity, and so you tend to get the splitting apart of peasant estates into smaller and smaller fractions. People are no longer self-subsistent. They become bandits, they become vagrants, they go to the cities in search of menial labor. Initially, this leads to a sort of a boom where you have all this free labor coming into the cities, but eventually it's too much for the municipal authorities to cope with. What you tend to see are, for example, churches. They tend to deal with these kind of biblical characters of like the widow and the old and the sick, and suddenly they're flooded with able-bodied young men, and they have absolutely no means of dealing with it. And this kind of rise of pauperism tends to create this societal anomie where people think there's something deeply sick and deeply wrong with their society, to where this prevalence of impoverishment is coming from. But the point is that and obviously you also have the price increases, which mean that more and more of people's income at a low level goes towards paying for basic commodities. But what this also leads to is not just for the peasantry, because this is kind of obvious, you also see deep changes happening at the elite strata of society and for the state. Because you have multiplier effects. So, for example, one of the examples from the book, which is obviously somewhat of a made up numbers, but I mean, it is based on a real historical reality, which say that between 1540 and 1640 in England, the population doubles, you get prices go up by 3 times and government revenue go up by 3 times. And it might seem like, the government has kept up with inflation because of the revenues, and therefore there isn't really a deep crisis. But if you think about the army, which has to be double the size because the population of Europe is doubled and you need to be competitive, well, each soldier's ration of stuff like beer and bread and stuff which relies on grain, the price for each soldier per capita has gone up. So you actually have a 6 times more expensive army because you've had inflation raised by 3 and you've got the size of it doubled. So you have all of these very nasty multiplier effects which can come from inflation, which tends to lead to these kind of systematic struggling for the state to generate revenue during these periods of crisis. And for the elites, they tend to you have some people who are shrewd and who jack up their rents, and there's people who profit from inflation through the asset appreciation of value, strategically selling and buying things, and because they're not affected by the rise of basic commodity prices. In fact, they can make more money of it. So you have an entrenchment of certain elites. You have other elites who, in this new period of rising costs, they are suddenly shoved down to the bottom of society. And you have other people who are able to rapidly become rich because of this as well. And so you have this increased social mobility. And so you have all sorts of, and what you also have, because of the rising population, is far more people competing for a small number of elite positions. So this is where the idea of elite overproduction comes from. And it's this combination of too many elites looking for too few positions, and the struggling of the state to absorb elite aspirants because of the revenue, combined with very serious popular discontent and a large number of what in a later revolutionary theory gets called the combustible material of young men, which generally that is the sort of like overall view of why breakdowns tend to happen. And so then the question is, well, why is it simultaneous? Well, it's basically because these demographic trends tend to be fairly consistent over the whole of Eurasia. And so you see crisis in the Ottoman Empire, you see crisis in China, and all over Europe happening around about the same time, um, in these cyclically recurring problems.
Uh,
But yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Goldstone makes a very good part about this too, where he says that really the way in which this text reads is about, and you mentioned it in your point there about the multiplicity of scales. These things tend to stack up upon one another, and in some instances, very linearly and sometimes almost exponentially. To cite the text here real quick, he writes, he says, "My goal to explain this crisis of state of the state as a crisis of both national and local authority, to explain elite conflicts as a set of nested conflicts that occur on local, regional, and national levels, and to explain popular activity involving conflicts that differ according to their regional and rural and urban settings. Such a widespread breakdown of order is typical of major state crises. Thus, the critical problem is to explain why institutions should break down simultaneously on a variety of scales and dimensions at a particular time." And in here, he makes reference to an American sociologist by the name of Theda Skocpol. And if she's still alive, she is the definition of a turbo liberal, in the sense that she wrote one really good book when she was getting started in her academic career, which gets cited extensively, which is the book State and Social Revolutions. It came out in 1979. And it's a fantastic comparative book against France, Russia, and China about their revolutions, 1917, 1789, and 1949, and the cultural great leap forward that came out of that. And then everything she wrote more or less after that is about just turbo liberal things regarding Barack Obama, the Tea Party, and the rest. Definitely something older. But in that text, Theta makes a great deal of work that Goldstone borrows off of, which is explicitly about inter-elite conflict. We discuss this a lot as a popular phrase and terminology in sort of these online right-wing spaces about the circulation of elites, which is where this gets talked about a lot exclusively, and the conflicts that happen from every level, whether it's the National Politburo, the Estates General, or even locally amongst your priests or abbots or someone who's meant to be the representative for a collection of peasant farmers. And Goldstone makes really good work off of this text. This was one I had to read when I was in university. It's well worth reading. Don't read anything else that she's put out. But I think that's sort of important to consider here is that you're looking at multiple layers in which there are conflict between power brokers and those that are considered dispossessed, uh,
Yeah, I
and
mean
that you
the
have to do it that way. And Goldstone's book is like the go-to place to look at it.
yeah, I mean basically what he does is he takes this structuralist foundation of how to look at society, but then he calls it a structural demographic theory, because demographics is it's in a sense, although not entirely, an external variable from these things, which enables which changes these dynamics, which directly affects these dynamics. And also, I mean, he uses the analogy of an earthquake, which is to say that multiple societies can have demographic problems which lead to crisis of elite recruitment, which lead to the immiseration of the standard of living for the populace, and which lead to financial problems for the state, which are it's what Lawrence Stone would call multiple dysfunction. But when you have these preconditions for a revolution, that doesn't actually mean there will be one, because you have to see how these trends affect a particular way of going about politics. And so you don't see a revolution in Britain, and there is a reason for that. I mean, there are structural and demographic reasons for that. For example, in Britain, we were much better at deporting potentially unsatisfied people to penal colonies. We had much more available ability to do that than the French did. But also there was like key structural reforms to the British state where the French state was stuck. And so, you know, you do it's not like a set pattern or necessarily a predicted theory as to how everything's going to work out, but you do more or less make sense of a whole epoch and a whole event when you understand the interaction between these two elements.
Quite right. And again, I'm really glad that you had recommended this book to me, just in part because it's good comparative analysis, but also at the same time, it's just a really good in-depth breakdown of everything, almost. I mean, all factors included. When we get either primary sources or we look at sort of contemporary historiography of this area, very little of, say, the interaction between, uh, government revenue and then wheat prices, disease, population all play a role. And now some kind of do. We mentioned it, I think, before we decided to record. But for instance, Carlyle's history of the French Revolution is probably one of my favorite, and it's probably one of the better in-depth ones that is contemporary of that time frame, where you start to analyze the relationship between the church, the burgeoning factions that have been fighting in the background of the Estates General, and then alongside the ongoing crisis of young men and where to find roles for them, and how that created tension amongst existing lineages of noble families. And so this is a really great place. Maybe we can start going into the French Revolution and sort of this breakdown in early modern Europe, because in the 25th anniversary opening, he's commenting, 25 years after this book came out in 1991. And he's noticing that, revolutions have not gone away. And Goldstone has spent a great deal of his scholarly career writing about revolution.
Mm.
And I think that it's sort of interesting that, he says, well, a lot of my contemporaries at the time had thought that maybe the century of revolutions of the 20th century had finally come to an end, only for that to, be very much disrupted with the collapse of Yugoslavia, with the color revolutions that have gone on in
Yeah.
Eastern Europe, and now the Arab Spring. And now you kind of get to look at this book and you see how he's putting on these scales and how all these different structures intersect with one another, and you finally
Yeah.
really get to see a clearer picture of how to analyze contemporary
I mean,
revolutions today.
there is actually a book called The Handbook to 21st Century Revolutions, which came out this decade, which Goldstone writes like a foreword to, which actually applies this very sort of analysis to the different revolutions in the Middle East, and since this book came out, which is definitely worth a read. Huge, huge book, but like maybe if you're interested in a particular case, it's definitely worth reading. I mean, but to get into the like French stuff, um, in the mid 17th century, there had been a widespread societal breakdown, which was centered around an event called the Fronde, which means the sort of the slinging. It's like this kind of light-hearted rebellion against authority. And it was this kind of like you had all these generals who were very charismatic, And that's what people tend to remember. But it was actually a period of total breakdown. I mean, it was not a fun time to be the average person, because you had a lot of mass starvation and a lot of death as a result of the war going on at this high level. But it was not a very ideologically charged conflict. It wasn't a serious challenge to the authority of the crown, but it left a very, very strong impression on Louis XIV's mind when he grew up at that time. And the late 17th century saw more or less constant war for France, but what you saw was a total population stagnation, a total cratering of any population growth in France. And this allowed agriculture to take over. And so you saw low food prices, low competition for spaces, and the state did go bankrupt after all of this war in 1720. But it was a kind of a bankruptcy which was rallying behind the nation at a time of war. It was the kind of bankruptcy which people understood, and also because the material conditions which people lived under were so relatively favorable compared to past centuries. I mean, Leroy Ladurie notes that like after 1675, there's almost no peasant uprisings whatsoever, which is just very striking given that you have one like every decade for like the last 200 years before that. And it's basically because it's not that hard to get a standard of living. Although it's quite a frugal time for elites because it is just less profitable. But this starts to seriously reverse sometime in the early 18th century. There's a number of complex debates around exactly when the population flips and so forth that we don't have to get into. What is known for sure, though, is that the main cause for the rise in the French population after the beginning of the 18th century was a decline in adult mortality. People lived for a longer period of time, they were less likely to die of disease and so forth, because actually in France, they delayed having kids relatively commonly, even in this time period. So it really was just people living longer lives for a number of reasons that enables a new wave of population growth in the 18th century. The 18th century sees a 36% growth in GDP up until 1789, and population grows 30% from about 21.5 million to 28 million. You have a doubling of agricultural output, and you have a tripling of trade and commerce, which goes from a quarter of the GDP to a third amount of the GDP, and very significant urbanization. So France is a bigger economy than Britain. France has more advanced trade than Britain, but France is saddled with an enormous agricultural economy which is very uninnovative, apart from some areas in the northeast of France. They just keep doing things the same way that they have been doing. They don't commercialize, they don't engage in advanced techniques. And so you do have a cratering of the rise of the agricultural output. And it's really after about 1760 where this starts to result in very chronic inflation. And also with the rise in the population, you see huge urbanization. So people's plots become smaller. They start moving into the cities in search of menial jobs, and by the 1780s, you have, just leading up to the French Revolution, some serious crop failures due to very harsh winters. And so you really are boiling over in terms of tension, both in rural areas and urban areas. It's a much more complicated story for rural areas, though, because there's a huge amount of regional variation, which is why during the French Revolution, you see places like Bordeaux and the southeast being very ambivalent towards the revolution. You have places like the Vendée, where people are very against the revolution, and then you have some areas like central north, which are very, very pro-revolution amongst the peasantry. So that's a very complex story, which it would take far too much detail to get into. But when it comes to the sort of to Paris, Paris is absolutely extremely volatile area. Real wages are plummeting for people, and there is very precarious labor for the average person by the time of the French Revolution. And of course, not only when you see a population growth is there a growth in numbers, but also you have a shift towards the younger, um, which is that as the French population grew 15% in 50 years, the number of youths aged 10 to 29 increased by 50% at the same period. Because with demographics, you don't see linear trends, you actually see non-linear trends, which is to say that, like, if you have two kids and each of those two kids have two kids, then that's four, and then it doubles, right? I mean, it's not a linear growth rate, and it's the same thing for a birth rate collapse. If you have a birth rate collapse, you have a very rapidly, disproportionately rapidly fucked up top heavy age pyramid, and a very rapidly um, than you would sort of expect, because people just have linear brains. They don't actually think in terms of their head, in terms of nonlinear trends. But yeah, I mean, agricultural output in France, it went something from 15 to 33%. So population growing 30%. At the absolute best estimate, it just keeps up, and in most estimates, it doesn't really keep up. Um,
to
and
to maybe
yes, yes.
highlight, especially because again the disparate growth with most of the population being it's about 80%, I think, is what he references
Mm,
specifically. Four fifths of the population earned its living in agriculture, where the
yes.
output per capita falls 4.3% over the course of the century. And at the
Mm,
same time, looking at the growth in all three major sectors of the French economy at this time, like agricultural, industrial, and trade. Trade is doing the best based upon aggregate data here. So
mm.
25% growth over the course of a century for agriculture, despite it being
Yeah.
the predominant area of the economy.
And in the last 2 decades of the old regime, you see a 70% increase in grain prices.
Hmm.
I mean, part of the last 2 decades of price increases is due to the massive government deficit. But we'll get into that. Um, but into the maybe the fiscal crisis next.
Yeah, absolutely. But also to finish that off,
Yeah,
industrial and trade grows by 80% and then 196% respectively.
yeah.
So just this vast difference between those that are doing well and can potentially buy themselves into a title of nobility or to
Mm,
be granted certain privileges, which causes already established noble lineages to now embrace competition. And then you, of course, have the masses that are on agriculture causing great problems in the rural area as well. And I think that sort of disparity that you need to look at is really important because
mm, mm.
you can't look at these sort of things about, well, growth or prices or how the government's managing, say, inflation with its
Mm.
revenues, if you're not looking at how unbalanced and disparate these sectors of the economy are.
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
you
And
can look
so,
at things so well, and then at the same time, it's like, well, actually, if we were to look at the majority of the population, most of them are not doing well whatsoever.
yes, exactly. I mean, it is growth, but it is deeply inequitable growth, because almost everyone is an agricultural worker, and that is a stagnant proportion of the economy. And almost anybody who's making any new money is making it in through either the colonies or through manufacturing, and this is a much smaller proportion of the economy in terms of the number of people involved. So then with finances, the finances that are ordinary expenditures just get much, much worse. So Eugene White notes this, like, he shows that from 236.5 million livres in 1773 to 283 million livres in 1781, um, and 329.5 million in 1788. And so some of this comes from debt payments, but a lot of this just comes from peacetime military and colonial spending. And revenues just failed to keep up. Um, I mean, Crown's ordinary income goes up by about 161%. Um, the Crown's income mostly comes from land taxes. And as we said, land taxes that's a stagnant income because agriculture is not really growing. And one of the problems with French society is that there are so many forms of local privileges, municipal privileges, privileges for the clergy, and privileges for the nobility, which make collecting any taxes incredibly difficult, and standardizing anything is also incredibly difficult. Um,
Yeah, we see this too. Is the quoting him here on page 197. The French royal income consisted of ordinary revenues from taxation and or extraordinary income from the sales of offices and royal assets and from loans. In the 18th century, the direct taxes on land were chiefly the taille, which was the capitation. And then the latter of the two, I'm not going to try and pronounce these, forgive me, were
yeah,
intended to be proportional taxes on all income, but later, as discussed later on in this chapter, the practice of these taxes simply became additional taxes on the land. The annual gift of clergy was also primarily a land tax, as agricultural tithes were the main source of church income. These direct taxes and other landed revenue from such sources as royal domains and forests made up just over half the ordinary royal income throughout the 18th century. The remaining ordinary revenues came from customs duties on trade and excise taxes on consumer products, including a salt tax. The customs and excise taxes were generally farmed out, an arrangement in which the tax farmer provided the king with an agreed upon sum, which was the estimated yield of the tax, less the cost of the collection and a profit for the tax farmer. Although this arrangement reduced the net yield to the treasury, it provided the crown with regular and predictable revenues while shifting the burdens of information gathering and collection delays on private financiers. It also shifted the focus of resentment against indirect taxes
mm,
from the crown to the financiers, who were reviled for profiting from the public purse. In the first decade of the 18th century, the total ordinary income was about 120 million livres per year, and that's where you get from there on. But I think that's sort of an important thing to consider in this factor is that not only is the resentment not just towards the crown itself, but it starts initially, of course, with a poorly standardized system of
yes.
relying on a class of tax collectors to do it for you. And what that
Mm,
can, that puts the tax collector and the financier in a position wherein they're now going to be the subject of public ire, and indirectly, of course, the crown. But that also means that you're setting yourself up for elite conflict between those that are meant to be the collectors themselves and then those that they work with as intermediaries to get an assumption of how they can profit themselves.
yeah. Um, I mean, and the fiscal crisis, it gets worse and worse, and the revenues become harder and harder to collect. I mean, it really is a recipe for disaster. I mean, from 1726 to 1788, pensions increased by 327%, diplomatic and foreign service expenses by 235%. Public works and charity expenses go up by 1,560%. I mean, the cost of policing becomes higher. The cost of enforcing order due to grain riots, the cost of protecting trade routes becomes higher. Cost of the standing army and navy go up 144%. I mean, the debt servicing obviously starts to become much worse. Um, all of these kind of ordinary expenditures increase overall by 207% over that time period. Um, and so, what you really see, which is important to note about all this, is that in the bankruptcy of 1720, people rally behind the crown because it's an easily understood form of crisis in terms of wartime debt payments. And then what you have is a partial bankruptcy in 1771 under Louis XV. And this was extremely unpopular. It came after the 7 Years' War. And in order to push this through, Crown and his minister Maupeou, um, they disband the courts of appeal in France, the Parlement, in order to push through this partial bankruptcy where they do not pay these loans. And this was deeply unpopular and it was considered tyrannical. And so this is all in everybody's minds in 1789. And not only that, but the last war which France fights before the French Revolution is, of course, the American War of Independence. And this is the cheapest war that France fights by far. I mean, it's financed entirely by loans, but it's the cheapest war that they fight so far, and it's victorious, unlike these previous wars. So it's victorious, it's cheap, and it is a very bitter defeat for France's chief geopolitical rival, Britain, and the Comte de Vergennes, who had orchestrated this conflict and had advocated joining this war. I mean, he had managed to arrange the French involvement such that all of the naval fighting for France took place across the Atlantic, and there was no serious risk of a war in Europe. It was an absolute diplomatic coup de grace, and but what you see is that the incoming of the loans being due in the 1790s becomes this enormous, huge sword of Damocles for the regime. And the question is, why is it that a small, cheap war, which wasn't even a large land war, is totally breaking down the French state, whereas previous, much larger, much more unsuccessful wars didn't? And the answer is that the cause for the systematic breakdown of the state finances are these long-term trends which make financing things like pensions and the sort of equivalent of welfare, the sort of state charity, and all of these running costs just go up whilst revenue stagnates. So the breakdown of the finances, which is announced to the king by the Contrôleur Général, Calon, in 1786, he convinces the king that there needs to be massive, widespread tax reform if they are to be fiscally solvent. And he convinces the king that this situation is that way. And the question is, why was it that the whole of French society was so fundamentally unsympathetic? And the answer is that demographics was a black box. People didn't understand these kind of long-term causes for problems, especially considering the inequitable growth that France had. You had the elites of French society who they tried to convince to come around to these reforms in the Convocation of the Notables in 1787. I mean, they are people who've profited off of the expanding of new industries, and they don't understand the underlying causes, and so they buy into all sorts of conspiracy theories. They think it's about speculation. They blame the Queen. They blame Marie Antoinette, and in particular, they blame the King's Contrôleur Général, Calon, because Jacques Necker in 1781 had published this book called the Compte Rendu, in which he had essentially claimed to be some kind of financial whiz who had balanced the budget, but in fact he hadn't. He had calculated that he had balanced ordinary expenses and ordinary revenues, and he'd simply left out the extraordinary revenues and the extraordinary expenses, which completely lent a picture that it was the government's fault. But I think that I'm beginning to sound a lot like Pierre Gachot, who was a far-right, Third Republican man. And Gachot had the sort of standard far-right French take of this time period, which was that it was the people who were obstructing the reform that are the bad guys here. I don't think it's that simple, because, in a sense, ministerial tyranny, just top-down decisions arbitrarily imposed with no public information as to what's happening behind the scenes, is what the nobles were afraid of. So actually, the nobles were quite sympathetic to pushing through a lot of reform. They didn't want it to just be pushed through arbitrarily with no expectation for why. And so I think that this breakdown is more tragic. I don't think anybody really has a full grasp of the weight of the situation until it's far too late. But
Yeah, no, and I think that what makes this chapter really highlight your thesis about just how clueless there is for a general understanding about where how things are being managed and where things are going. I mean, he kind of just lays it out for you that the tax rate in both England and France rises at the same time. However, England's income per capita per individual is about 13.5% higher than the average French person in 1789.
Mm.
Their trade constitutes double that of what the French are outputting, despite the fact that France is an incredibly rich country and with a higher population than England
Yes, I mean
does.
the
Yeah, I
thing
mean,
that
what you see, at least for how Goldstone outlines it, is like there's no way that anyone's going to have a cohesive or even a holistic picture of how bad things are unless that information has been either A, deliberately hidden, or B, you had access to it, which I don't think anyone during the course of the revolution can
I
articulate
mean
that
it
at all.
does. I mean it does kind of make me think of the baby boomers, because with boomers you have people who make an awful lot of money through the inflation of asset prices. And then they sell their property to multinational corporations, and then of course they leave their progeny with nothing, so that they can have a nice retirement. But of course, they don't realize that they're actually just have guaranteed that their descendants are going to be downwardly mobile, because with the chronic inflation, the cumulative inflation that we've had since the 1960s, which has been persistent due to consistent demographic growth, through mass migration, is that they made money off asset appreciation, and now the very wealthy have gobbled up most of the assets, and it's impossible for the young people to get on the property ladder. And so the point is, whenever you have this inequitable growth, the people who do well off of it don't really realize how bad things are, or at least a huge proportion of them don't. Many of them do. Um, I mean, it's not as if all boomers are just a monolith, but yeah.
No, but I mean, it is that monolithic behavior, however, that
Yes.
generates the. Uh, Not to be completely Girardi, and there's a lot of things I disagree with, but I
Mm.
mean, like you get a scapegoat very
Yeah.
easily manufactured for you to go for. But I mean, with respect to just back to economics, I mean, you
Mm.
have this fiscal crisis is compounded by the fact that yeah, we have these ability to collect revenues, but the entire economy, despite our wealth, is not growing at all like our competitors, so we can't really actually pay anything off in respects because the entire agricultural sector has seen a significant decline and there's no growth there whatsoever. On top of the fact that there's an increase in the adult population, there's overpopulation leading to rural flight into urban
Mm.
areas, which creates greater discontent politically. And then on top of all that, like you had mentioned, there are no meaningful reforms to deal with this issue. And so you have people trusting in a system that has always existed or that has been nominally working for them with no contextualization for how it's applying to the outer classes. I mean, like we're sort of privileged today because of modern technology where we can easily see, how the other side lives to borrow an old title. But here you don't. And instead, like we were talking about earlier, you get this really regionalized difference in opinion
Yes.
towards the revolution.
Yeah, you absolutely do. I guess the so we've covered the kind of the underlying fiscal problems and the problems from the sort of the bottom up. The final aspect of the theory is elite overproduction, and the term elite overproduction is one that's caught on. But the term which tends to get used in the Goldstone book is what he calls overturn and displacement. And I actually think this is more useful, because it
I agree.
specifically tells you how people are kind of screwed over by these demographic processes. So elite displacement is that you have a stagnant amount of government patronage and an increasing number of people who want the patronage. You have an increasing number of people who want to be elite aspirants. There's only so much money that the government can actually hand out, and so there's more and more fierce competition over a smaller amount of positions, much more jealousy towards the people who do get the positions. It's essentially like the game of musical chairs where you add more and more people each round rather than decreasing the number of chairs. And people begin to get more and more violent and more deceitful in terms of how they're trying to get on them. The and then the second is overturn, which is to say that it's much less guaranteed that you'll be able to maintain your status because of rising costs. And so you have this kind of shuffling down and shuffling up the social ladder. And a huge part of this is because, well, wealth dissipates within generations. So if you have demographic growth, then someone comes from a noble estate. Well, that's going to get split, and it's going to get split and split and split over this period to the point where, as Nogare said, like you get like the lord of like the like frog pond and the rabbit hole, you know, rather than just clinging onto their title as the only thing that's left. And on the other hand, you get a huge number of lawyers. You have tons of, I mean, the main route of advanced social advancement is the law degree, which is still true to some extent today. And people who are avocats, they are absolutely struggling to get positions as magistrates or higher up positions within the government. And so what you see is really an inversion almost of the Marxist narrative, which is that if you look at the third estate is not this burgeoning class of new money, which is overthrowing the feudal order. That's just absolute nonsense, because France at this point is still a society dominated by the idea that if you are landed, then you are someone who's someone, and if you're not landed, then you're nobody. It's much later where commerce and industry totally takes over as being the only means in which someone is really considered successful. That's much, much later than the French Revolution. What you actually see is the exact opposite. It's actually the downwardly mobile bourgeoisie who are the most likely to be French revolutionaries. So it's like people like Robespierre and Danton and Marat. I mean, they are generally from this archetype of people who are struggling lawyers, struggling small government employees, and the point is that they are not represented in mainstream society up until this point, up into the before the calling of the Estates General. When you think of the bourgeoisie, you are thinking about commercial people engaged in new enterprises, but they're the least likely to be revolutionary. They're the most likely to want to become a noble and to buy into the system of doing things, whereas it's the people who are failing that are very angry. And then on the other hand, with the nobles, the prominent court nobles, the prominent nobles who have enormous amounts of money and who are very likely to be engaged at the cutting edge of industry, they're the most likely to be reformists. I mean, they host Enlightenment clubs in which the ideas of the 18th century are discussed and people read Voltaire and so forth. I mean, these people were the least likely to be revolutionary. They were very likely to want significant reform to the system. However, when the Estates General is called, it is the silent majority of rural, impoverished nobility who have nothing, who are elected across the different subsections of France that turn up. And so, in other words, it's the most conflicted people that are artificially brought together within this strange institutional system where you have these orders of society that vote by order rather than by head. And with the clergy, you observe a similar thing where the episcopacy, the prelates, are appointed by the king. Yeah, I mean, in France, you have a whole complex history with the Catholic Church where this sort of thing happened, called Gallicanism, which goes back to the 14th century. But in any case, you have them, and then you have the lay priests who, again, their income is being undermined by inflation and struggling parishioners not being able to give lay priests any serious money. And so you have this massive conflict within all three estates, within these classes. And it's when you put them together in this adversarially structured system that it explodes, and you get the French Revolution, which is the declaration of national sovereignty by the Third Estate and the dissident priests. And these are all people that are high up in society relative to the peasantry. But it is essentially the workers of Paris and the indigents, really, of Paris who are decisive in taking the side of this dissident faction and leading to revolution, which is almost impossible to deal with because any law enforcement is likely to have massive class overlap with these people, and likely has very, very, it's very unreliable. What you really would have had to have had would be a large peasant army from outside Paris to deal with it. But it's just there was no political will for it, and that's what actually leads to the actual revolution happening.
Yeah, there are a few things I want to sort of elaborate for those that are listening. The turnover and displacement of elites is, I think, a really important point here. And for the context of the French Revolution and its nobility, Goldstone writes, under the condition of sustained population growth and fiscal stringency, the situation of turnover and displacement, mobility, where the number of elite aspirants rises faster than the number of appropriate positions, is likely to rise. Under the conditions of demographic stagnation, where elite families usually have only one surviving son each, or even fail to reproduce, and so create vacancies in the social hierarchy, and such mobility conditions are likely to occur. In old regime France, social power and precedence were realized somewhat differently. The legal status of nobility had far more importance than that in England, while local level power was less important. Thus, in France, elite divisions were more likely to crystallize around the issues of nobility, whereas in England they crystallized around county leadership. Nonetheless, the underlying process of conflict formation was the same, an excess of qualified applicants pursuing a less rapidly expanding number of elite positions. And then he goes on to cite Leroy Laudrier, who tells us that during
Yeah,
the first half of Louis XIV's reign, there's no upward social mobility. And then after 1650, if you're in the even if you're part of a landed aristocratic class, there is nowhere for you to go. You are
yeah.
landlocked here, and the increasing divisions of property lines and labor means in an instant your son's expected inheritance is halved or reduced to a fifth of what it was, and now you have resentment and even more young men that are going to live longer and be of a sort of serving military age that can be used against you whether you know it or not.
Yeah, I mean, matriculations at university increased by 77% between the 1730s and the 1780s, whilst the population during that time period climbed only 16%. So again, when you tend to get these things, they tend to be nonlinear. You tend to have, with these growths of population, a much more disproportionate growth in elite aspirants. And when you get this kind of increase, then it just becomes more and more difficult to accommodate these people. And unaccommodated elites are one of the like systemically destabilizing factors in any society. I mean, you see the exact same thing, for example, in the Russian Revolution. The czarist bureaucracy during the last decades of the 19th century, going into the 20th century. I mean, it increases somewhat in size, but the number of people who are university educated goes up drastically. And so, a lot of these, a lot of communists are actually gentry. A lot of the communists were actually from noble background. They were much more disproportionately likely. The anarchists and the narodniki, the populists, were also very noble dominated. And again, it's because there's no positions available. And this is a seriously destabilizing factor over and over again. And of course, we see that exact same thing today, which is one of the reasons why this is a relevant text. I mean, you have
Yeah.
more and more graduates taking non-graduate positions.
Mhm.
I mean,
The aspirants, whether I mean, so often they get just sort of dismissed as midwits or whatever online,
mm,
but I mean, these are men and women who are sold on the social promise or the social orthodoxy that if you were to do these things, that you are to be guaranteed something. And while
yeah,
America has no sort of heritable nobility, although really we do if we look at the data, that you sort of see the classic recipe for social dissolution and social disunion in the same way that you see described here, because there are less and less rooms for patronage in here. And I mean, even Goldstone writes about that, talking about the freeze in social mobility, that the local patronage levels break down because there's an
Yeah.
increase in taxes in order to meet revenue demands for
Mm.
debts. And then on top of all of that, Goldstone highlights really quite well that those that are what everyone is now trying to do is anytime that there is a new office that is opened up that is meant to have on immediate, signing of the paperwork, that it's supposed to have 100%, heritable,
Yeah. Yep.
transmission. Like those get closed off to any aspirant outsider. Like they have to stay within already a small amount of elites, and
Yeah,
most
I
of
mean,
them
the
are not
other
having
aspect,
children to begin with.
which is particular to French society, is that offices and government positions are basically for sale. Some of them confer nobility, most of them don't. But William Doyle, I think I'm quoting Goldstone here, in
Mhm.
systematically examining the price of offices in the courts and municipalities, found that they rose from 300 to 600% from 1710 to 1790s. In some particularly prosperous towns, such as Bordeaux, the price rose even greater, a nearly tenfold increase, and prices continued to rise steadily up to the end of the old regime. Um, I mean, getting these positions and these offices just becomes more and more and more expensive, and the whole system of ennoblement and reaching new offices and available positions is just clogged. It's totally clogged, and that's why you have these very resentful people. Now, I think that there is one further aspect of the French Revolution which I think that we have to talk about, which isn't talked about a huge deal in the text, but it's the emergentist nature of the French Revolution. What I mean by that is that modern leftism did not, in any sense, really exist before 1789, because more or less everybody who has problems with the state up until 1789 phrases it in conservative terms, in terms of the state overstepping its boundaries and stepping on traditional liberties and traditional privileges. It's when you get these forces meeting together at the Estates General and the reforms not being able to come through there due to the institutional structure that you have new forms of politics emerging. And every aspect, every side of the French Revolution appeals to the Enlightenment. And what you see with the nobility is during the Cahiers of the historical of the French Revolution. Cahiers is the complaints. So there's essentially this huge opinion poll before the Estates General where the complaints of the different segments of society are raised. And Nogaret is a great historian who goes into the enlightenment of the nobility, and only 3% argued in favor that the king was sacred and inviolable. 88% of nobles argued for equality of taxation between the estates. 50% wanted a constitution. Only 17% wanted the nobles to maintain seigneurial privilege, which is to say the quasi-feudal way that they would extract revenue. I mean, there was a huge number of things which they were willing to do in favor of the national interest, but they were disproportionately not represented. They're what Nogaret called the reformist minority, which was that when voting by head versus voting by order comes about, you see 188 to 46 voting in favor of that. So you have a significant reformist minority which is elected, but they are the minority because it is the rural and military nobility which is disproportionately elected, the people who've done worse. And then on the other hand, if you look at, just from a purely empirical standpoint, you look at the people of the Third Estate, they bought into the system in terms of how things would happen. For example, you see Danton called himself D apostrophe Anton, as though he came from a fake noble lineage. Robespierre was calling himself de Robespierre. Marat was calling himself de Marat. Brissot called himself de Warville. And it's just ridiculous. All of these people had come up with, Roland called himself de la Platier. I mean, all of these people had created these elaborate fake noble heritages. They looked up to these Enlightenment noble clubs. And also the nobility, it was the Committee of 30, was this body which had, I believe, Mirabeau and Lafayette in it, and they were the people who encouraged the bourgeois to advocate for the voting by head. And, I mean, it worked a little bit too well, because they didn't know that they were going to be outmaneuvered on every angle, and that the nobility itself would fundamentally come under attack during the revolution. And so what you see is that what leftism really is, as it emerges in the French Revolution, is Enlightenment rhetoric which previously had not been revolutionary, because almost all the Enlightenment thinkers themselves believed in a narrative of linear progress where we would slowly overcome superstition, slowly become more rational, slowly do things better, incrementally improve things here and there, and reform the way things were done. Whereas it was not revolutionary. Whereas it was after the revolution happens that these people who are thrust, these counter elites who are thrust into a position of power, cobble together using Enlightenment rhetoric, all of the liberté, égalité, fraternité rhetoric of the French Revolution. It self-radicalizes. This is what Francois Furet points out in his excellent book Interpreting the French Revolution. It is this self-propelling radicalization where the threats to the French Revolution and the insistence on these Enlightenment ideals within this violent context just becomes more and more violent over time as they try to be enforced. And so, yeah, it is an emergent phenomenon. I don't think you can say the Enlightenment caused the French Revolution. It's only in a very indirect sense, which is why the historian Monet says the history of the French Revolution itself and the history of the origins of the French Revolution are just two different histories. They are simply two separate histories.
Yeah, no, I agree with that wholeheartedly. And I mean, there's a passage here from Goldstone about this crisis of power that which you had referenced to here, that I think is just really important for the listeners to sort of get. So I'm just going to read it in full. Larger families also increased social conflicts. Poor noble families had traditionally been able to secure places for their children in the army and in the church, where they received preference in royal appointments. But as non-noble and recently ennobled families joined the ranks of aspirants for such positions, nobles came into competition with whose men whose station in life in all respects other than the possession of ancient nobility was identical to theirs. The positions that old nobility had traditionally dominated thus become more difficult to obtain precisely when they were most needed. Houghton notes that toward the end of the 18th century, as their need to find an income for their sons independent of family land grew with rising costs in larger families, the noblesse became increasingly defensive of their monopoly on those positions. End quote. The downward mobility of many noble families, owing both rents eroded by inflation to larger families, which divided inheritances and created impoverished younger sons, led to sharp clashes with upwardly mobile families recently ennobled who sought marriages and offices appropriate to their new stations. Nobility as a personal virtue was once associated with honor and service, but in the late 18th century and also in the 16th, old noble families stressed that nobility was a quality of breeding and noble birth, or of military virtue, which those of common origins could not attain with the mere purchase of the title. Social distinctions were preserved by hypergamy, a situation in which women who carried a dowry could marry into families of higher status, but men were denied the same opportunity. Thus, quote, in Paris, a wealthy common-born female married a duke and was presented in court. The provinces of a common-born male, however, rich he might be, had difficulty in marrying the daughter of a ruined marquis. And I think that that's sort of I'm instantly thinking about a sensitive young man discourse that I see on the timeline.
Yeah, I mean, you do. I mean, that is one of the key conflicts, is that you have older, you do have these older typically. And one thing I should actually stress though is that when it comes to these intra-elite class conflicts, there are always exceptions. You cannot, as a general rule, say, well, you can, as a general rule of thumb, say that the rural, poorer nobility were the ones who were fighting hardest for their privileges and were the most resistant to the necessary reforms. But it's not always true. There are just some stark exceptions to it. And there are people who are lawyers who opposed the French Revolution. I mean, you can't just simply predict using some kind of Marxist or material analysis exactly which individuals, how they're going to behave. I think that one of the other points from the book, which is hammered home, apart from this emergentist conceptual history of the French Revolution, which I think is important, is what I would call very pretentiously, but I will just elaborate on what I'm talking about, a non-linear chronopolitics, which is to say that chronopolitics means the politics of time. And the first person to write about this, I think, was Condilis. And so the point is, it's about the narrative that a regime situates itself with respect to the past, present, and future. And so what you get after the French Revolution, especially, is a kind of a linear chronopolitics where everything after the revolution is good, everything after the revolution is moving forward, everything before it is bad. The actual term ancien régime in French doesn't mean ancient regime, it means the previous regime. It just means the regime prior to the one that came after. And because the ancien regime was an incredibly sophisticated, complex social organism, it's not some ancient thing with respect to the people that existed after it. But what you see is that the French Revolution, it really lasts until 1799 when Napoleon takes over. Because during that period, you still have food riots. You still have massive intra-elite competition for small number of spaces. You still have problems of inflation. You still have problems with the peasantry. You still have everything which the king had to deal with. Just because you've chopped off his head does not mean that all of the problems that the previous regime had to deal with magically go away. And so this is where the phrase, the French Revolution, comes from the French Revolution, Mallet du pain. He came up with the phrase, the revolution eats its own children. This is why. These internal conflicts don't simply disappear because of a regime change. And indeed, France does go bankrupt, and they do have hyperinflation because of the assignat scheme. And I mean, there was a particularly famous, well, not famous, but there was a very interesting account in like 1793, and it's like, I don't understand what's going on anymore. Like every revolutionary committee is now also a committee against the revolution, and everyone revolutionary is now getting their head chopped off, and like I don't even know what's going on anymore. But that is what happens, and people tend to follow the story up until the execution of Robespierre. But you have 5 more years under the Directory of this exact kind of chaos continuing. And Napoleon resolves the issues of the French Revolution in a whole number of ways. But basically, what happens with the French Revolution is that there's a number of splits within the regime, which just immediately become very transparent over the church, over the monarchy, over a whole host of issues where people are forced to take sides and they are forced to fight to the death over who can manipulate the mob and who can control this mass unrest most effectively. Carlyle believed that really the 3 people who were able to do it were Danton, Lafayette, fuck's sake, who was the third one? Never mind. 2 out of 3 isn't bad. But the real point being that the French Revolution, it creates a whole set of new problems. It creates a new world. It creates modern political culture in terms of what we discussed today. But it also has to deal with the archaic. The archaic doesn't simply disappear. The old problems simply don't disappear. But what Napoleon basically does is he massively increases the funding of the gendarmerie. He massively increases the funding for the police, which prevents any kind of urban rioting from threatening the regime. And the other thing he does is he massively reshapes the finances. He totally reshapes the financial situation so that he actually moves towards indirect taxes. I mean, in the text, Goldstone says, they needed to move over to indirect taxation. But Napoleon does it, and he creates the Bank of France, and he totally stabilizes the situation. I think Napoleon is probably as much of a political genius as he was a military genius. And that's really when the revolution comes to an end. It's in 1799 onwards, during the first consulship of Napoleon. And but the point is that this refuses to accept a kind of linear chronopolitics where you have this before, after, and things are better after, things were worse before, or that things are suddenly different now. and we don't have to think about the same problems, and it's all in the past. And also, the other thing is that the punchline is you ask the question, well, why does France keep having chronic instability up until the mid 19th century? Well, the population just keeps going up. I mean, until then, I mean, after the reason why the book actually concludes in 1850 is because after 1850, apart from Russia, agrarian crises ceased to be a thing due to new technology and the importation of Russian and American grain. And so after that point, you can't have the same sorts of analysis of agrarian society because it's very fine grained, no pun intended, analysis of agrarian societies. And the model has been applied to post agrarian societies extensively afterwards, but that's not what he focuses in the book. But I mean, things do really substantially change after the mid 19th century. Insofar as you try and understand society. I mean, you have the movement towards social democracy, managerialism, and a whole host of new, different kinds of politics that simply don't exist at this time.
Yeah, and to highlight the chronopolitics point, I mean, there's a section where he talks about the burden on the cities, and Goldstone, quoting Montesquieu, says, the state owes all of its citizens an assured food supply, and references the next 40 years the French monarchy trying to make this work, both inside urban and rural areas, and the economic situation just does not allow that to happen. Citing Jean-Marie Roland, an inspector for manufacturers, just workmen today need twice as much money for their own subsistence, yet they
Yep.
earn no more than 50 years ago what they were when living was half as cheap. So, I mean, you have these inflationary pressures, the inability to meet the demand of production. And even then, throughout the entirety of the revolution, as you had noted, and as what Goldstone points out, the crisis of food does not go away. And the horror stories that come inside France, I mean, hence the phrase "the revolution eats its own children," becomes quite abundantly clear. Throw this on top of the fact that even with what existing urban order exists, not just inside old titles of nobility, but just general positions of power and those people trying to defend their families, they're still competing against everyone else who had recently moved there that already hold political viewpoints that are revolutionary or dissident to the existing order, and now they're all trying to find labor themselves. And I mean, the crisis, I mean, history speaks for itself in that respect, but I mean, it
Yep.
really does highlight that old problems do not go away, as you had mentioned, just because the king is decapitated.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that if we look at our present, if we go back to the present, I would say that we're obviously not dealing in Western nations with a crisis of overly high birth rates and the problems which come with that eventually. I mean, we are dealing with falling birth rates, but what I think is still there is the nonlinearity. And also, I mean, you do have a fiscal crisis that is coming as a result of a rapidly aging population. I mean, you have the unfunded liabilities of the pensions. You have the new workforce that's necessary in terms of care and medical to deal with that, and you have them moving towards retirement, and therefore a much smaller proportion of your population being working age. And the point is, you look at the underlying reasons for fiscal crisis. I mean, that is the fundamental one, and that will have cashed out by the middle of the century. I mean, I did post a while back, like, people sometimes talk about like an incel uprising in South Korea because there's such like antagonistic gender relations there. Whereas I think, look, if there's going to be an uprising in South Korea, it's going to be young people against the old, where you have such a rapidly aging population that you are having to dedicate your entire life towards funding it, and you can't do anything within the democratic system because they outnumber you. And you can easily see, like, but old people, they can't really do violence, and so it's very easy to see that that is a dysfunctional society, in which you see a potentially revolutionary situation arising as a result. But if you want to take a lesson from the book, you want to forecast problems in the future. You're not being like fucking what is old hist and like predicting a civil war like with certainty. Like you can forecast crisis, though you can forecast no, with these demographic trends, if they remain reliable, which we have very robust reasons to do, we know that there will be problems. And also, it affects society at sort of a fractal level. I mean, he calls it sort of a fractal breakdown. Because, recently I was looking at debt in Canada, and like the point being that you have household debt being like 2.9 trillion Canadian dollars. You have like the state debt, so that's like at the small level, but then the state level, the highest level, you have massive debt. But then, of course, you look at the individual provinces and like corporate debt. I mean, that's also a problem. And you tend to always see this dysfunction mirrored at all levels when you have these kinds of problems, and demographics kind of shoots through them at every level.
Yeah, they do, and it's particularly interesting because they'll talk about, say, incel uprisings, and a lot of that language in literature that they're cribbing off of comes from a totally different model in a different part of the world. So in the late Obama administration, there was a renewed emphasis from Hillary Clinton, the Obama State Department, Samantha Power, and the rest to have this conversation, quote unquote, a feminist foreign policy. This runs from about 2012 to 2015 exclusively. And the emphasis is trying to explain things predominantly in like sub-Saharan Africa. So they'll reference things like, well, there's an increase of population of young men. There's inflationary pressures on bride price.
Yeah.
Ergo, people seek status and money through groups like Boko Haram and the rest. And
Mhm.
now they're trying to apply that model to everything from people who enjoyed Joker to what's going on in South Korea, or even the manosphere as of late. I mean, I find the Tates absolutely detestable,
Oh,
but
of course.
I've noticed the literature and the language that comes out of that literature being applied to the same sector, and I think it's a really piss poor cross application of demographic
Mm.
studies and the ongoing problems that exist inside our own issues. It's like, well, really, no. And I mean, what you're going to see, and we can forecast problems. I mean, I'm not saying Civil War II is happening, or even the gentleman in
Right.
England who's claiming that, but like we're going to clearly see the aspirant class of usually like white zoomers and millennials that are trying to find something for themselves, who are also having this crisis of reproduction, not only subsidize the elderly, but also have to compete against a class where they're not just
Of course.
subsidizing the elderly, they're subsidizing an entire class of foreigner.
Right.
And so like you will have problems. And I mean, like, and Goldstone gives you a pretty good model to operate under.
Yeah, I know, and I think that what you really see is a total loss of any kind of centrifugal force for your society. And I think this is why people have often very wacky foreign policy positions, is because there's just such little reason to be invested in the formula of society succeeding when you have devalued credentials, having to subsidize various kinds of foreigners, part of a kind of coalition, a political coalition, and the elderly on top of that. And like, there's no reason to be invested in the system working unless you are massively extracting passive income from it via usury or rent or dividends, or something like that. I mean, unless you're that wealthy, you really don't have anything going for you in terms of the system, and therefore people just don't care about whether it succeeds. I mean, when Trump announced all of those tariffs, there was some people who, who cares if the stock market crashes? I mean, like. I mean, people really, really don't care. And the reason why they don't care is because the elite formula of running things that's been the case since the 1960s, it's just no longer functional. And that, again, it's a question of a structural demographic analysis. I mean, you have the structure of how we do things and the demographic trends, and you can clearly see that something has to give here. And if you're young, especially, and you're an aspirant, there's really very little going for the present situation, and that's exactly the same for a huge number of people in 1789 France. I mean, one of the things that is part of some of these models, the actual mathematical models, because he does create this mathematical model called the like multiple mobilization potential, which is his like single factor which predicts instability throughout the book. I'm not going to go into how he calculates MMP. Later, people also invented elite mobilization potential, these different calculus for how you predict instability. But you look at today's society and like you apply these models and they are getting worse. There was a paper in the Cryodynamics Journal, which has a lot of journals which use these kind of models about Britain and America. And yeah, it does reflect that we are presently in a kind of a deconsolidation of the regime, a tendency towards instability, and it all you need to do really it's not about applying essentially a very rigid model of looking at things. It's just to say that you want to identify problems and inescapable problems. You just have to look at the structure of how your system works, and then look at the demographic trends which potentially make it stronger or weaken it, and where you are along in that cycle.
Yeah, and if those who have the text are interested, it's on page 281. I'm not also going to try and give you how to break down MMP because it's quite its own thing on its own. But he does
Yeah.
offer a model for this pressure and how it rises based on the ecological, financial, and political data that we have available to us. And I mean, this is the thing in which Goldstone sort of concludes this whole section on what the French Revolution is that Marxist inspired historians and social scientists, they simply just want to give you this sort of rather univariate linear analysis of just like capitalism and bourgeois forces
Mm.
against a growing population. He says, well, that model is not it's not good at all. Despite the fact that Goldstone's a total liberal, he's at least willing to call them out where they stand. You need to have you need a material analysis, yes, but you need the conjunction of all these other crises in which we've talked about throughout this recording.
Mm.
The material, agricultural, political, and social. By 1789, all of these things coming together makes any sort of political solution insoluble.
Well,
And so
I mean, there was a
there was a
possible.
political one, but I mean, not in the sense that we could have gotten something different than what we did.
Well, I
uh,
mean, I think that the point being that there was a lot of countries who had similar problems to France who didn't have a French Revolution. I think that the French Revolution playing out as it did was a result of the way in which institutions were set up in France.
Correct.
Um, like, it's very hard to see it not happening exactly as it did, based on how those are set up. Though I will admit that.
Yeah, and citing Vauvel, he points out, he says, perhaps it's fortuitous that all of these different movements were in any such case uncoordinated and unconnected.
Mm.
So perhaps that's the case. But I mean, Goldstone offers a good ecological model, and he doesn't mean that just in terms of, say, the ecology of um, weather patterns or a bad winter causing these crises, but a political, environmental, and demographic ecology that allows you to get a multifaceted approach to understanding political pressure and how they rise. And we picked the French Revolution to talk about today because this is I think, the revolution that most people know, and most, if you have even a basic history understanding of the world, or you have a history degree, whatever, I think that most people kind of have an idea of the French Revolution. That's why we went with it. Um, but I mean, is there anything else that you wanted to discuss before we get towards the conclusion? If there's anything that stuck out that you want the audience to hear?
I mean, I can't think of anything super obvious that I missed out off the top of my head. I mean, the French Revolution is a massive topic. I mean, we've barely scratched the surface here. Um, but like in terms of an overview of like how it happened, I can't think of anything obvious to get into.
Well, then that might be a good place to wrap it up. I mean, this is only just really, we talked about the thesis of Goldstone's work and then the French Revolution and its application. There is still hundreds of other pages and other parts of history that we have yet to break down
Oh
or
yeah,
look at, and we,
I
we are
mean,
going to we're going to record another
I
one.
feel like there has been a little bit of a renaissance of like caring about the English Civil War recently. Like I see people like Cromwell posting, so it might be interesting to do a breakdown of that. But it is definitely more like far distant history removed from the present scenario. But yeah, I don't know if people would be interested in that.
Well, I mean, as I've said on many other recordings that I do with colleagues and mutuals on Twitter, I make this content for me and to talk to
Yeah,
interesting people. If you liked it, I'm glad. If you didn't, well, fuck you. Like, it's really for my enjoyment as someone who gets to make money doing politics and history on the internet. But Mr. Zoomer Schopenhauer, where can people find you? And if you have any work, you're more than willing to promote it. I will have it in the description to this video.
I am on Twitter and I have Substack, and I've been somewhat better at uploading to it recently. So that's pretty much what I am about at the moment.
And do you want to tell people where to find you on those two platforms? What is your at and what's your Substack?
The Substack is called Right Book Club, and the Twitter at is Jus du Raisin Groy. Um, uh, yeah.
I'll have those linked down below in the description. Mr. Zoomer Schopenhauer and I will return sometime after Easter to discuss probably the English Civil War and the breakdowns therein. Until then, I hope that you all enjoy this. Of course, this will be open for patrons on Substack and Subscribestar first. You guys will get to listen to it, and then the rest of you will get to see this later. But until then, I hope that you all have a great rest of your day, evening, night, morning, wherever. And Mr. Zoomer Schopenhauer, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much.